Got it. All right. Thanks everyone for joining. Welcome to our virtual career series. We have a special program today. We have two speakers. The first is C.Taylor, and Chuck is the Executive Vice President, Head of Financial Crimes at AML RightSource. And then we also have with us Professor of Communication, Dr. Norah N.Dunbar. So both of them are going to be speaking today and sharing information on this topic about detecting deception. And Chuck is going to share information about what the heck that is in a career standpoint, what that means for a career and job, because there is a lot to unpack here. So I know you're going to love it. And I wanted to let you guys know a couple just housekeeping things as we get started. We are having the chat open. So if you guys have questions at any time during this, please feel free to throw a question in the chat and we will ask that as the speakers are presenting. And of course, leave plenty of time at the end for question and answers as well. And you can also raise your hand or just come off video and just ask us live. We would love to hear from you that way as well. So I'm going to go ahead and share just a couple slides about what this program is. And then the speakers, we're going to start with Norah starting off on the topic. So we'll go to her slide first, and then we'll go to Chuck. So let me go ahead and share my screen so I can get this presentation up for you guys. Share my desktop. Oops, and okay. So let me go back here. So this is our monthly career series. For those that aren't aware, we started this last year during the pandemic so we could connect students with alumni to chat about careers. So we host this the second Wednesday of every month during the academic year. And so this is our kickoff session. So thank you for coming. And this is again on detecting deception because Norah has been doing fascinating research on this topic of deception. And we just happen to have an alumni council member that has a career directly related to this area. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. And for the rest of this, let me go to the next slide. For the rest of the year, we have more. And why it's not going forward. Here we go. So today we're talking about careers in financial crimes. And then next month, we're going to be meeting Claire. And Claire is on the call with us today. And she's going to be sharing information about her career in the tech industry. So talking about marketing and technology. And then for December, we have Shafali, and she's also in marketing. She's going to be talking about product marketing, and she works for Virgin Pulse. So I hope you guys can join us the next month, November and December. And of course, we'll share more about the schedule for January after that. So I'd first like to have us start with Norah, and I'll go to her slide, and Norah can kick us off and talk about the topic of what is deception. Norah?
Yes, I'm happy to. So I teach a course called Understanding and Detecting Human Deception. I've been studying deception for about 20 some odd years. And what people always want to know about deception is, how do I tell when somebody's lying, right? That's the most important question. And my answer in my class and in my research is that there's no one cue. There is no Pinocchio's nose. Because when we're talking about deception, we're talking about knowingly causing someone to believe something that is false. So that means the deceiver has some sort of intent behind the lie. They're trying to tell something that they know to be false. Now, that can be expressed in a lot of different ways, and different people might have different ways of showing that lie. It's something that we call leakage. So you are strategically controlling, if I'm trying to lie to somebody, I want to look credible. I want them to believe me. I look them in the eye when I talk to them. I might try and not give anything away. And so I get kind of more tense in my body, and I try not to gesture too much. I might have more tension in my voice. I might have certain ways of talking that are kind of illustrative of deception. And there might also be physiological responses because that tension and that stress that I'm under causes my heart rate to go up. It causes me to sweat more. It might cause my pupils to dilate. Those kinds of things. But I always tell my students that if you learn one thing in my deception class, it's not to look for a Pinocchio's nose, not to look for the one cue. Even if it's somebody close to you and you think you know their tells, it might change from circumstance to circumstance. So you have to be really, really ready and willing to look at a variety of cues. So for example, let me talk about the linguistics for a minute, because in my experience, a lot of the research is on nonverbal cues, right? Gestures, facial expressions, body language, that's what people have been studying. And it's only recently when we got better at, automatic transcription and things like that, that researchers really turn their attention to the linguistics. And we're finding the linguistic cues are just as informative as the other nonverbal cues, and maybe even more so. So for example, if I'm lying, I'm under a lot of stress and I'm under what we call cognitive load. So that means when I'm talking, it's more difficult for me to be creative in my language choices. And so if I'm telling you a lie that's off the cuff and not planned, I am going to tell it very simply. I'm going to use more simple words. I'm going to repeat those words a lot. I'm going to use shorter sentences. I'm going to have longer pauses in between my sentences. And so those linguistic cues can manifest themselves and make the lies detectable. Now, the advantage that we have now that we didn't have 20, 25 years ago when I started studying this is that now we have computer algorithms that can look for all these things at once. Because it used to be you had to have a human do it, and now we can do things with technology. And so I can have a computer that's listening to someone and transcribing every word they say and telling me how many action verbs they say in their statement. I can have a computer algorithm that reads their facial expressions and tells me how emotionally expressive they are or if they're more reserved. I can have a computer algorithm that even tracks their gestures and their voice and their physiological measures all at once. And so in my deception class, I spend many weeks talking about all of these different things in much more depth, but we thought it would be really interesting for you all as students to talk to someone who does this for a career, who tries to understand, not only, when people are lying, but what kind of clues will help them in order to uncover that deception and be an interesting way to try and discover it. And so I was excited when I heard that Chuck was willing to give a talk about this as one of our alumni council members, because I think he will agree with me that you can't just look for one thing. You have to be open-minded and look for a lot of things at once. And so I'm going to turn it over to Chuck. And if you have more questions for me before he talks, you can ask them now. Let me see if there's anything in the chat. Not yet. So if anybody has questions, we can take them now, or you can wait until after Chuck talks and you can sort of mull over questions while he's talking.
Great. Thanks, Nora. I'll turn it over. We can certainly ask questions, and if I see theirs, I'll pop in. So thank you, Nora. We'll turn it over to Chuck for your slide here.
I'm really concerned about all the nonverbal cues in my body language and such now, because I think Nora's going to be watching me to see if there's anything going on.
All right. And all right, I have you in 2 slides here, Chuck. So I'll go to the next slide when you're ready.
Sure. So thank you guys for joining. I think it's going to be a fun conversation. Like we said in the beginning, please ask questions. Makes it much more interactive, and you guys signed up for this hoping to hear something, I think. So if we don't cover it, please jump in and ask the questions. But just to start a little bit of background on me. So I graduated from UCSB in 1991. Like many folks in the communication major, I thought I was going to go into marketing or some sort of career, behind or in front of the camera or something like that. And then once I got out of UCSB, I actually took a couple temp jobs, moved around in my career, and I ended up kind of falling into the financial crimes field. I took a temp job at Santa Barbara Bank and Trust. In Santa Barbara, it no longer exists, but was a great place to work. And I got a temp job there as a compliance analyst. And they came to me at one point and they said, "Hey, Chuck, there's this regulation called the Bank Secrecy Act. And we need somebody to take over that program for the financial institution and help us fix all these issues that the regulators found." And I said, well, okay, I have no idea what that is, but I'll jump in and help as much as I can. And so at that time, this was early 2000s, right after kind of 9/11, or excuse me, right after 9/11, when there was the Patriot Act came into play and all that kind of thing. And financial institutions were required to do a lot more in regards to detecting financial crime, that being money laundering, fraud, terrorist finance, all that kind of stuff. So I fell into the career, had no idea that financial crimes careers really existed. But at every financial institution throughout the US, be it a brick and mortar bank, an MSB like Western Union or PayPal, social media companies like Twitter and Facebook and things like that, where they actually take money and move money. And then things like Venmo and Stripe and Square and all those types of entities, they are required to detect and deter financial crime. So there's this kind of, it's kind of like anything you get into. Once you get into a certain thing, be it, I don't know, my son's involved in table tennis, and I never knew there was this huge kind of underground environment of table tennis. And once you get into financial crime, you kind of realize that it opens the doors to all sorts of really fun things. So I fell into the career. I had no idea it existed, but I'm really happy that I did. At one point, I wanted to be an attorney. I actually went to law school and I interned at the DA's office in Santa Barbara, California. And at the end of that, though, I realized that I didn't really want to be a prosecutor. I thought I had wanted to do that, but through that process, I found it rewarding to put bad guys away. But I kind of realized that I just didn't really want to do that as a career. So like I said, I took a temp job at Santa Barbara Bank and Trust, and the rest is history. So the tie-in here between what Norah was talking about and my career is deception. And so in simplest terms, my expertise is in money laundering detection and deterrence. And the definition I threw in here of money laundering is because it kind of explicitly ties back to ideas in regards to deception. So money laundering involves the disguising of financial assets so they can be used without detection of the illegal activity that produced them. Through money laundering, the criminal transforms the monetary proceeds derived from the activity into funds with an apparently legal source, right? So long-winded way to say bad guys normally are trying to gain money through some sort of criminal activity. Most criminal activity, the goal is to end up with money, right? There's crimes of passion, whatever else it is. But in many types of crime, you're trying to get money from somebody for something that's illegal. And so once you have that money, you want to be able to use it like everybody else does. Write a check, send a wire, pay your bills, use your credit card. But in many environments, you end up with piles of cash, and it's hard to use that. You can't walk into almost any place and use more than $10,000 in cash without it getting reported to the government. So you want to hide that money, and you do all sorts of different things to deceive people around that. You can take that cash and do a myriad of things with it. You can divide it up, deposit it in small amounts. You can change it to money orders. You can do you can buy art with it. You can buy diamonds with it, whatever it might be, to be able to disguise the source of that money and then move it and be able to change it into something that appears legitimate, so you can then use it to buy your fancy car in your house, whatever, right? Most, drug kingpins around the world aren't driving a Pinto and living in a double wide. They are transforming the proceeds of their criminal activity into things that appear reasonable so that they can use them in a meaningful way. And the best money launderers normally have some sort of a front company that they're using, that they can commingle that money together so it appears legitimate. In the movies, you always see, a bar that nobody goes to. It's just, the folks that are involved in that ring of crime. But the bank deposits that you're seeing for that particular bar look legitimate. You compare them to other bars in the area. There's cash activity, lots of cash activity, maybe some credit card, whatever else there is. But The best ones have a really reasonable front company so they can commingle those funds, and it makes it easier to deceive the financial institutions and law enforcement that money was gained in a legal way. So I mentioned before that every financial institution has, so I transitioned from being a banker and, you know, detecting and deterring money laundering for financial institutions. About 3 years ago, I jumped over to the consulting business. So now I help financial institutions do that. But a lot of what folks at financial institutions do, and then I help them with, is things like customer due diligence, transaction monitoring, and identifying the sources and uses of funds. So a little more detail on that. Every time a person or a business opens an account at a financial institution, there is what's called KYC, know your customer, and then customer due diligence. And the lion's share of that is just capturing reasonable demographic information about those folks. So if I open an account, it's, you know, my name is C.Taylor, I live on this street, my social security number is this, my occupation is this, my expected activity through the account is these types of things. And then the financial institution risk rates me based on my propensity to commit financial crime, based on all the factors that I've given them. So if I am a criminal, I am going to create some sort of a persona that makes it reasonable for the activity that I do to look like it matches the activity that's going to occur. So back to the bar that I mentioned, right? Say I actually sell drugs and I want to have a reasonable way to get that money into an account at a financial institution. I would have that bar, restaurant, gentleman's club, arcade, places where you would expect cash activity to go on. And I would open the account with documentation that looks legitimate. Sometimes it's fraudulent documentation, but many times the person that is opening the account has gone through the proper channels to open the business in a meaningful way. Gone through a process to open an LLC or a corporation or whatever it might be with the state that they're in. So the documentation that they provide appears legitimate. So they're deceiving the financial institution into thinking that this is a legitimate business. A lot of things that financial institutions are dealing with today are things like cannabis companies, right? It is very difficult for even a state legal cannabis company, say in California, to open an account at a financial institution, because anything they do, any cannabis they sell at their dispensary, the funds from that are actually the proceeds of a federal crime, because having cannabis, marijuana, is still federally illegal. So even if there is a state legal business that is doing that under all the requirements of the state, any revenue they make from that is still actually the proceeds of a federal crime. And a financial institution that takes that is actually laundering that money for that business. So folks like that open accounts under, it's a consulting business, or they have some other front company that makes it appear legitimate to have all sorts of cash. So that kind of in a nutshell is the way that people or businesses try to deceive financial institutions into opening an account to allow them to take that money that they gained illegally, get it into the financial system, and then use it in a meaningful way. Any questions on any of that? I've been rambling for quite a while. I don't think anything's come in the chat. Awesome. Okay. So the next step would be transaction monitoring. So again, back to every financial institution in the US is required to detect and deter financial crime. The best way to do that is to have some sort of a software system that can mine the data at that financial institution. So say it's back to me at Santa Barbara Bank and Trust. We had a transaction monitoring system where we took all the cash activity, wire activity, ACH activity of all of our customers, and we dropped it into a system, and we would have rules that we use to detect anomalies. So for instance, there are behavior deviation rules. So if Chuck normally takes out, or excuse me, normally deposits $100 a month into his account, but this month Chuck deposited $8,500 into an account, that would pop out as an anomaly because it deviates from the past behavior that I've done. That would pop out. An analyst would look at that and they would say, well, Chuck's never done this before. He deposited $8,500. Is that reasonable for him to do based on his occupation, what we know about him, all the information that we collected in the customer due diligence process? So other things that you look for, there are normally rules that are identifying just large transactions, be it cash, wire, ACH activity. There are rules that look for deviation in what somebody is doing over time. So maybe for me, all I ever do is get my paycheck, pay my mortgage, and I pay bills. But for some reason during this month, I sent a wire to a company in Mexico. That would pop out as a deviation from my behavior. If it was over that threshold, then it would pop out for an analyst to review. Same type of thing. Does this make sense for Chuck? The person that he sent this money to, do they have the same last name? Is it in a business that appears to be reasonable for him to be doing business with? That kind of thing. So all of that is going on. And where deception comes into that is if, like I talked about before, the person or company has set up a persona that makes it appear that that activity is legitimate, then the analyst that's looking at it is just going to check the box and say, okay, based on what we know of Chuck or this business, it's reasonable for him because of what he told us. If it doesn't, they might investigate it further. And if it really doesn't, they normally will reach out to the customer and ask questions. So Chuck, you've never done this before. Why did you deposit $8,500 into your account? Now, if I am a criminal and the $8,500 is because I'm selling cocaine, I'm going to say something like, well, I sold an RV. I sold it to my neighbor. My neighbor gave me $8,500 in cash, and that was the source of funds. If that happens one time and the bank thinks that's a reasonable answer, they're going to check the box and be done with it. If I start depositing $8,500 every Tuesday and Thursday, and they know that I'm a consultant, it's not going to make sense for what I told them in the beginning. They're going to get suspicious of that. They're going to ask me more questions. And it's going to be harder and harder for me to deceive them about the source of those funds. I'm not going to be able to say that I sold an RV every week. I'm not going to be able to say that, in my consulting business, everybody pays me in cash, because that just doesn't normally happen. So if there is enough suspicion about what I am doing with my cash activity on that account, the financial institution may or may not file what's called a suspicious activity report. And if they do that, it goes into this big database where federal law enforcement can query that information. And, if, say, for some reason I trigger for criminal activity, whatever it might be, say it's an FBI agent, they can then query that database and see that Chuck's doing all sorts of weird cash activity. They can use that to bolster their investigation and such. So to just kind of level set, customer due diligence, I'm going to lie and or set up a persona that makes it look like the activity I'm going to do makes sense. With the transaction monitoring, there's going to be folks looking at my activity. They're going to be looking at that customer due diligence to see if, based on what I told them, that it makes sense. If it doesn't, they're going to ask more questions, and I may or may not be able to deceive them with my answers about that activity. And it goes from there. They might report that, they might close my account, all that kind of thing. So I kind of covered again the false claims about sources and uses and all that. So I'll pause again and see if there's any questions.
Chuck, can you share like a story maybe about an especially interesting case that you had, or something memorable that came through?
Great question. Let's see. The sad part is that most of the stuff that people like me detect is people that are trying to avoid taxes and doing it in a way that makes it look like they're doing some sort of financial crime, right? And or they are doing something that appears suspicious, but there's a reasonable explanation for it, right? So most of the alerts that I'm talking about end up being either explained away because somebody has a reasonable explanation for it, or whoever's looking at it just identifies that they're trying to avoid taxes. But so let's see. Probably one of the most memorable stories that I have is back to my example about a cannabis company. We were investigating a particular LLC. So somebody had opened an account. It was something like, Chuck's LLC. And the customer due diligence information was that they were going to be consulting with law firms in the area. And just that was all the explanation that there was. They started depositing cash into their account. And over a period of time, the cash just didn't make sense for that particular business. And we started asking questions, and they stopped depositing cash, and they started putting cash into a safe deposit box because we could see that they were doing it. We started asking the branch, okay, monitor this customer because they're doing cash activity that doesn't make sense. We started asking questions, and they stopped depositing the cash. We could tell they were putting it into their safe deposit box. And then an investigator went kind of above and beyond. And while they were doing their investigation, they found that one of the signers on the account was an advocate for the cannabis industry. And then the next step was they found that her husband actually was identified as an investor in a cannabis dispensary. And so all of those things linked together. We figured out that they were kind of conspiring to take that cash from actually a legitimate cannabis dispensary and take that cash and try to filter it into our financial institution. And then at one point, we told them that they couldn't keep any more money in their safe deposit box, and they came in like with a legal box and filled it with what we think was just hundreds of thousands of dollars of cash. So gained from a state legal legitimate source, but the proceeds of a federal crime, and deceiving us all the way through that, and us reporting that as suspicious activity along the way. Law enforcement then gets those suspicious activity reports. They reached out to us, and we gave them all the information because you're allowed to do that under the suspicious activity reporting requirements. We found out later that they were doing that same thing at 7 different banks in the area. So they weren't just doing it with us, they were doing it all over the place. And in the end, they found that these folks were, have millions and millions of dollars coming out of this cannabis dispensary, state legal, but they were depositing it into accounts in suspicious ways. And one key factor that I didn't talk about before, if you deposit more than $10,000 into a financial institution account, then they have to file what's called a currency transaction report. So at 10,001, that is triggered, you file the report. So most folks will deposit less than that, $9,900 ongoing. If it's apparent they're doing that to avoid the currency transaction report, that's called structuring. You file that suspicious activity report. All that money that they have structured into the account can then be seized, because just by doing it that way, even if it's legitimate money, that's a federal crime and law enforcement can take all that money. So combined with what those folks were doing, they were structuring cash into all sorts of accounts. And then so law enforcement got to seize all that. Law enforcement loves that because they can take all that seized money and use it for their investigations and all sorts of stuff. I feel like I have better stories than that, but that's the one that comes to mind at the moment. Maybe I'll think of a better one while we're walking through, but thank you for the question.
And we have it on the career slide now, if you want to address that, Chuck.
Awesome. So like I said, I fell
And then
into this.
and we do have some questions. So if you want to address the careers, then I can stop sharing and we can go into more questions.
Do you want to do questions now? And then
There was one question from Lindsay that asked, what is a typical day like for you?
Typical day. So I head the financial crimes advisory practice at AML RightSource. So I have a team of folks that are helping financial institutions to implement and test and tune the transaction monitoring systems that I talked about before, helping folks build policies and procedures to identify financial crime, helping them do risk assessments and all that kind of thing. So my day is spent overseeing all of that. A lot of what I do is meeting with current clients to give them my opinion on things that they're doing. So it might be, hey, Chuck, I am a fintech and I do all sorts of payment processing. And we are dealing with folks that are using our app to gamble. They are putting in the notes of their, so Venmo's not a client, so I'll use Venmo as an example. I have lots of clients that are like Venmo. If you know anything about Venmo, when you do a transaction, you can keep the information public, right? I can say, I'm sending Elena $1,000 to settle my poker losses for the weekend. And so this entity wanted my opinion on what they were doing about the gambling activity. I also am trying to sell stuff, right? I'm meeting a lot of times with new companies that we're not working with to try to sell, our services. I'm writing stuff all day. I'm writing documentation. I'm writing risk assessments. I'm writing my opinion about the way folks are doing things. So it doesn't sound all that exciting, but it's really fun for me because most of the time I'm dealing with novel things where a financial institution has come up against something that they've never dealt with before. And they reach out to me and say, hey, Chuck, what would you do in this situation? What would your advice be? If you were going to do this, what documentation would you want? How would you, represent this to a regulator that's asking questions, all that kind of stuff. In my former life as a banker, it was much more about, hey, Chuck, this suspicious thing came up today. We think that we should file a suspicious activity report, but the team here is divided. What would you do? So I give my opinion on that. I would be dealing with, risk rating customers and all sorts of different things. So simplest terms, every day is different. A lot of times I'm just doing doing Zoom calls like this and talking to clients, giving my opinion about stuff, giving them feedback, talking about issues that they have. Every financial institution that has a financial crimes program has some sort of a government regulator that is coming in at least annually and trying to poke holes in their program. And when those holes get poked, folks reach out to me and say, hey, Chuck, what would you do to appease this regulator to make it so that they're not poking this hole or that this hole can be filled? So not the most interesting answer probably, but it's hard because every day is different. Does that make sense?
That's great, thanks.
Awesome.
So if you want to address this slide, then we'll open up to more questions.
Awesome. So I think I said in the beginning that I had no idea that financial crimes careers really existed. So every financial institution in the US and brick and mortar financial institution, and then what are called non-bank financial institutions, that's basically any entity that is accepting money and then moving it to somewhere else. So Facebook takes money from their users and moves it on to people that are selling services on Facebook. They take money from their users and they move it on to charities that are raising funds via Facebook, that kind of thing. Just because Facebook is taking that money, taking possession of it and moving it somewhere else, they are a non-bank financial institution. They have to have the customer due diligence. They have to have the transaction monitoring, all that kind of stuff. Every single financial institution and non-bank financial institution that is regulated in the US has folks that are doing financial crime investigations, program building, training, all that kind of stuff on an everyday basis. Crypto companies, entities like Coinbase and things like that have the same exact thing. They are required to detect and deter financial crime. So it used to be, hey, working for a bank isn't all that interesting, but working for Coinbase or Facebook in their financial crimes spaces is a little more interesting, a little more sexy, a little more appealing. And so in the beginning, when I started this 20 years ago, it was folks that were forced into it or fell into it. These days, there's a lot more people that are choosing financial crime as a career and getting into it because it is pretty interesting and it's a very broad field. So once you're in the financial crime space, there's basically three things that you do. You help with investigations, program management and risk assessment, or data analysis. And I'll pin on the data analysis because that is really the most important thing that my team and folks that work at financial institutions these days it's the most important thing that folks do, because to identify folks that are trying to deceive financial institutions, you have to use technology to identify anomalies, to identify simple things, right? If I say that I live in Ohio and I am a consultant, but all of the transactions that I do are, via my phone and the IP address says that I'm in Iran, that is something that's really interesting. And there are sanctions rules out there that say that US firms can't deal with transactions directly from Iran. So that's a big red flag. And without data analysis and being able to look at IP addresses and the places that folks log into their phones and their computers, you can't really get to that. So the lion's share of my team are folks that are data scientists that are able to implement, test, and tune these transaction monitoring systems, and then come up with reasonable ways to help financial institutions with all the data they have. And then the other lion's share of folks that are in financial crime investigation would be in federal law enforcement. So the FBI is a big part of it, but the folks that are kind of known as the best financial crimes investigators are the IRS criminal investigations. And so, there's folks out there that are auditing returns and that kind of thing. But once there is indicia of actual financial crime, it gets handed over to the IRS criminal investigations folks. And these guys are masters at analyzing data, forensic accounting, all that kind of stuff. So behind the scenes, they're doing lots of really, really interesting stuff. So if you have an inkling of getting into financial crime, you can do it at financial institutions and or law enforcement. And I'm sure there are other places that you can do that as well that I'm not aware of, but all over the place. And Elena, I think you are in financial crimes on some level too. So I know that there is interest in this group, and I know you asked some questions earlier, but I can't remember all of them. So if you want to ask me those questions, I'm happy to do it.
Great. If you guys have a question, again, feel free to just shout it out, or you can drop it in the chat. We have, it's 6:40, so we can either stop at 6:45 or we can keep going. Norah, I just wanted to turn over to you. Is there anything you wanted to comment on based on what you saw? And Norah just popped
Yeah, I just put in the chat that UCSB has a brand new major, a data science major, that I've actually been on the planning committee for the last 2 years. And the comm department offers a class in data science for communication majors that Ziad Matni teaches. He's a jointly appointed lecturer between computer science and comm. And what the data science initiative that UCSB is starting, the idea is that you have your home major like comm or economics or whatever. It can be a social science or humanities or whatever, but you can also get this like certificate in data science, or what they're trying to get approved right now is another major. So you could even get a double major. But what they want people to do is kind of get the basics of data science. So you take a couple of statistics classes, and then you can have your classes in comm count toward the data science double major. So it's still being reviewed, but the website about it, so you can learn more about it, is there, because I think that's going to be a huge trend in the future, is institutions looking for people who can understand big data. So if you get, massive amounts of data, how can you make sense of it? And, communication is really embraced that. There's a lot of people in our field who do things like they'll study like 10,000 tweets and try and find a theme, or look at, what's happening in the tweet. So people who study the new media in our field and things like that, are social media, are really embracing this. So I think that's absolutely going to be something that would be a good skill to have in the future.
Awesome.
The other thing I was going to say is that I really liked this because a lot of times my students will take my deception class. It's a popular class and it's a sexy topic. And they're like, so this was super fascinating. What do I do with it? And the only thing they can think of is like, maybe I, need to be a prosecutor, or maybe I need to work in the criminal justice system. So this is another interesting thing that they can do if they have an interest in deception detection and get a really interesting career out of this.
What resources would any of you recommend for people who are interested in gaining more of a deeper understanding of deception and financial crime spaces?
So I can go first. So simplest thing I would say would be, there are lots of great resources out there that will send you kind of ongoing alerts about things in financial crime. So there's the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, or FinCEN. You can go to their website, sign up for their weekly alerts. They'll send you information on, financial institutions that have issues, countries that are money laundering havens, whatever it might be. The FBI has a resource like that. The OCC, or the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, and their BSA, Bank Secrecy Act, or AML, anti-money laundering alerts. They have great information there. There is the handbook that federal examiners use to review financial institutions. I'll put a link in the chat. Is the FFIEC Bank Secrecy Act exam manual. And it's a guidebook for an an examiner to go to any financial institution and say, I should look at this and this and this to understand whether that financial institution is doing a good job in their financial crimes compliance. So I'll put a link there. There's also certifications that you can get. I am a certified anti-money laundering specialist from the Association of Certified Anti-Money Laundering Specialists. That is a great certification to have if you want to get into this field. There's other ones as well, but that's kind of the Cadillac of the certifications. So I'll stop there, and Norah can give some maybe information on just general deception, good stuff.
I don't know. I think you gave some really good advice for financial crimes. I don't know that I have. There is like the Defense Academy for Credibility Assessment, although they just changed their name to something else. They keep changing their name. I think that's because they don't want us to find them. Is basically a place where you can go learn. It used to be called the Department of Defense Polygraph Institute, but now they do a lot of training on things other than polygraph, because it's a lot, credibility assessment is a lot bigger than polygraph nowadays. And so that's a place that might be a good place to go for training after your bachelor's degree, if you're interested.
Yes. Any last questions before we sign off and say goodbye to Chuck? I know you're staying late for us. I appreciate it, Chuck. You're different time zone.
All good. It's my pleasure.
All right. Okay. Well, we'll share this recording on the website, and feel free to, Chuck, folks can reach out to you on LinkedIn if they connect with you on LinkedIn. We love that too. So, and hopefully you can join us for the next sessions in November and December. So thanks everyone for joining. Thank you, Chuck and Norah. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.